And as we pick up where we left off, I've called the first one, looks pretty Deadly Dan, so to speak, the presumptuous prediction. We know that Haman didn't like the Jewish people, and particularly Mordecai. He had a bit of a beef with him because he wouldn't conform and stand down, and we trace it back to the long-standing relationship that was between the Jews and the Amalekites. And here, this prediction, how was Haman going to pull off this rather ambitious plan to terminate all the Jews living in Persia by gaining the king's approval? It sounds easy, but it's another thing to be able to get a king to, give you a rubber stamp. And now, the interesting thing is, Haman had all, if you like, the resources. He had counselors he could rely on, but he couldn't trust them enough to give away the real agenda that he had to remove all the Jews. He had to know the right place, the right day, the right method, and whether or not it's worth doing. He didn't want to take an uncalculated risk. And as most Persians of the day, they were very superstitious about days, about colours, and about events. So they consulted the astrologers and magicians to gain an advantage from the gods about whether to go ahead or not on certain days. Now, I always remember being taught, or the saying was, don't ever cross paths with a black cat. Why? Poor old black cat had nothing to do with it, but it was considered bad luck if a black cat crossed your path. Or it was bad luck if you walked under a ladder. Remember that? Now, reason being, well, you could have something fall on you. A bucket of paint, could a brick fall on you, anything could happen. It was a lot of ifs. But the Persians also had these superstitions as well. They wanted to make sure that when they did something, it wasn't on a certain day, or there was a certain colour involved or something like that. Don't do it. So they looked for their gods, so to speak, to give them an indication of what the right day might be. And it was believed that through astrology, observing the movement of the planets, they gave them godlike features and power. So each planet represented a god or goddess who ruled over certain areas of life. As a result, the king and the elites in the Persian society highly valued the astrologers and their practices in trying to understand the future. To gain an understanding of what the gods intended, they used divination practices such as casting dice, reading animal entrails. I couldn't think of anything worse. Casting bones, reading tea leaves, it goes on and on. All of these things that they consult. Using these means and methods, they communicated with the gods who they believed shaped and controlled all the destinies and events throughout the world. Now, divination presupposes supernatural cause and effect in all perceived phenomena. It assumes the cooperation of all the gods and their willingness to reveal their future intentions. In the text that follows, we find that Haman was a superstitious person. He wanted a sign from the gods that would enable him to carry out his plan to eradicate the Jews and be successful. In other words, he wanted to gain the favour of the gods before he went ahead and risked his future. So he was prepared to look for a sign. Now, the action that takes place in verse 7, it was the first month of the 12th year of King Xerxes' rule, the month of Nisan. Now, if you want to implement an agenda, if you want to have a successful campaign, it's knowing the right time to take action. In other words, when to move, when to make suggestions. And the question was, Haman was asking himself, when is a good time to put my plan into action. Our text says that in the first month of Nisan, that was the time Haman chose to consult with the stars, with the spirits, to see when the right time would be, when the planets would all line up together and give him the best advantage for making his plan. Now, as I said, he was a superstitious man. Now, being number two, you would think, well, he's got everything available to him, wise men, and yet he's very superstitious. He was very thorough. He was very committed in whatever he did. So one of the things he learned was patience is a virtue. It's something you had to get right. So you waited, you saw the opportunity when it presented itself, and you took it. He had learned this over the years. And he refused to be rushed. He wasn't one of these spur-of-the-moment guys that just said, oh, that'll do. I'll just do it tomorrow or the next day. Everything had to fall in place before he risked his future or his family on a whim or fancy that could fail. In other words, he wanted to make sure he gave himself the best opportunity he could to implement this so he would be successful. The anticipation. That is the lot, was thrown before Haman to choose a day and a month. So the 12th month, the month of Adar, was chosen. Now, one old-time commentator that I found says the casting of lots to determine a lucky day on which to do something was common practice in Oriental kingdoms. It means that every cast they made stood for a day. They would cast the dice out and name the cast for a certain day of the calendar year. If the right number came up, then that day was called the lucky day. So they went through 365 casts. That's a lot of throwing of, one after the other. There had to be a lucky day there somewhere. But they cast 365 days before Haman decided that's the day. That's the lucky day. Now, how he knew it, I don't know. But he found the lucky day, and it was the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. According to Jewish tradition, and the Jewish commentators and rabbis have this understanding of it, Haman was also an astrologer. And when he was about to fix the time for the massacre of the Jews, he first cast lots to ascertain which was the most auspicious day of the week for that purpose. Now, as he's superstitious, each day, however, proved to be under some influence favourable to the Jewish people. So if he picked Monday, no, can't have that because something was happened that favoured the Jews on that day. Then he sought to fix the months, but he found that same truth was true of each month. Thus Nisan was favourable to the Jews because of the Passover sacrifice, Iyar because of the small Passover. So he's throwing these dice, which month, which day, etc. I wonder whether he thought, which hour do I pick as well? And so every time he threw it, a day came up, can't have that because the Jews are doing this. Can't have this month because the Jews are doing that. And then he finally came to the month of Adar, and he found it was the sign of Pisces, the fish, and said, according to the Targum, now I shall be able to swallow them as fish which swallow one another. He found his month, Pisces or Pisces, the fish. So that was the month Adar. So out of the 365 counsellors, they weren't good enough. They didn't measure up, though, to the advice of his good wife, Zeresh. She it was who influenced Haman to build gallows for Mordecai, assuring him this was the only way in which he would be able to have victory over his enemy. So Never underestimate the power of your wife, even if you are superstitious. And he was very superstitious. Now we have the perceptive proposal. Now once you've come up with the day, the month, you come up with this plan. It's ambitious. You need to come up with a strategy. I've got all my dots or all my ducks lined up in a row. How do I get the right people to put it into place? You have to come up with a strategy that appeals to the king without hesitation, so that he will give you, that's a good idea. It gives you complete control over it. Now to do that, you must understand the king. What interests the king the most? What gets him on the same page that helps distract him from seeing your real intentions of why you've promoted this plan? And so it wasn't hard in Xerxes' case, because Xerxes had a massive ego problem. He really loved himself and his abilities. So you appeal to his sense of importance. You butter him up. You lay it out for him, the prospect, hey, look, I've got this plan that's going to make you absolutely wealthier than you've ever been, and it will expound the boundaries of the Persian Empire. Now that's enough to, like a hook, to get a fish, just to nibble at it. So he appeals. Now understand, the Jewish people had no idea what's going on behind the scenes here. As far as they were concerned, life was good. One of their own, Esther, was in the palace as queen. What could possibly go wrong? Little did they know about the skullduggery that was taking place behind the scenes, with Haman and the king would eventually give an executive order signing and putting to death all the Jewish people. Now that shows us how driven and how determined Haman was to get rid of Mordecai and the Jewish people. He was prepared to take the biggest risk of his life just to get rid of them. But then again, you can have all your superstitions, you can have the best advice, but if you count God out of things, then you do so at your own peril. And Haman had no idea that God was at work and had plans to preserve his people, and that Haman was about to reap the very thing that he sowed to get rid of the Jewish people. It would be turned against him. Now the agenda. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain group of people scattered among the other people in all states of your kingdom. Their customs are different from those of all the other people. They do not obey the king's laws. It's not right for you to allow them to continue living in your kingdom. So you've got this agenda. You've got to employ the right strategy and techniques to the right people at the right time if you want to make sure the plan is adopted. So Haman approached this by appealing to Xerxes' ego. Knowing he thrived on accolades and approval, and he'd done his homework, he was very thorough, extremely well confident in what was about to say to the king. He took the Mordecai incident and blew it out of all proportion. He presented an outrageous proposal that there was a certain group of people who thought themselves above the law and immune from obeying the king's law. Now, the innuendo was such that, hey, these people you've got in your kingdom, they're different from everybody else. They have their own laws, they have their own customs, and if they're allowed to continue, you know what, king? This would set a bad example for every other citizen in Persia. So the best thing that you can do is to confront this problem, and deal with it before it gets out of control. So Haman suggested, hey, it's better, Xerxes, if you got rid of these people, then everything will be as it should be. And of course, his strategy was sound. If there was a group of people who were a threat, who were promoting a rebellion amongst the Persians, then hey, it couldn't be tolerated any longer. That's what Xerxes was good at, putting down rebellions. It didn't matter one iota that there was no truth in the proposal. That's why I say it was outrageous. I have no doubt Xerxes, if he'd used this up top a little bit more, instead of having his ego stroked, he would have heard about any opposition. He would have had his ear to the ground that there would have been some rebellion among his citizens, and he quickly would have put it down. And so I find it hard that he would accept the proposal of Haman without examining to see if there's any fact. But fact went out the window. Much like a lot of our politicians, it's not based on fact, it's based on appearance, innuendo, what somebody says, not the truth. It's no different here. He was acting upon an innuendo that had no basis for truth. Yet notice the appeal. If it pleases the king, I like that. If it pleases the king, now it's saying, I'm not telling you, king, that you should do this, but if it pleases you, let an order be given to destroy these people. Then I will pay 750,000 pounds of silver to those who do the king's business, and they'll put it in the royal treasury. Man, if I was the king, that's done the deal. You've got me. Talk about the art of sealing the deal. It takes an astute politician or person to take a proposition that's pretty shaky to begin with, see it through, which tells us a lot about Haman's influence and character. He was careful not to overstep the mark when it came to the king's authority. He presented himself as a concerned citizen with a possible solution that might be beneficial to the king and to everybody concerned, except if you happen to be a Jewish person. Now, his true art of deception and mastery of a situation, he knew what made the king tick. So he knew how to sweeten the deal and make an immediate impact by offering an immense sum of money that would certainly make the king sit up and take notice. In other words, he was a politician that was willing to put his mouth where his money was, his money where his mouth was, and back his proposal. Now that would get your attention. And it certainly got Xerxes. But he didn't come out and reveal to the king his real motive for wanting to get rid of the Jews. So he distracts him from seeing the real motive and suggests that the king will not lose anything if the Jewish people are removed from society. He's implying that they don't contribute much anyway. But if the king implements his plan, he's got the potential to become immensely rich and wealthy beyond what he already had. Now that's the art of sealing a deal. And so he contributes to the king's coffers. Now one has estimated that that would be around $10 million today. Now he was going to pay that directly to those who did the business, but that money would go find its way into the king's treasury. From him. He was the second highest person in the land. He had riches, he had money, he had done deals. Not all good deals, but he had a lot of wealth behind him. So he understood that the only way to get the king's attention was to sweeten the deal. Stroke his ego and put some money in the pot. How could you resist? It's like setting a trap, putting a bit of cheese in and saying, come on, Mousy, come on. If you've done your job, the trap's shut. And this is exactly what he was hoping for. Now, it worked a treat. It was simple. Convince the king Mordecai and his people are a threat. Entice him to think that you have a plan that will make him wealthier than he's ever been. And what have you got? You've got a recipe for success. All the king had to do was trust Haman with a plan. It was a win-win situation for everyone. Problem gone, king very rich. What could possibly go wrong? He thought he had it figured everywhere. We see the approval. So the king took his signet ring off, gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jewish people. So he had figured out the king. He knew how to exploit the king's weaknesses and make the right pitch. He was successful. And it seems Xerxes was one of those characters that acted on the spur of the moment. He didn't think things through. Remember when he got rid of his wife Vashti? It was a spur of the moment thing. Here he is again, a spur of the moment thing. All he can see of is money, money, money. I'm rich, rich, rich. So he made the decision. And that was all he wanted to see. No thinking consequences of what he was doing by giving permission. So in effect, he was allowing control to pass to another person who would change the course of history. He was blinded by riches. That was all he could see. Now, I would have thought that a responsible king would have investigated some research and thought and tried to find out, are these accusations correct, before committing himself to do such a thing. But he didn't. He gave over his signet ring, and it was like giving him, if you like, a blank check to do whatever he wanted with the king's blessing. Now, I don't know anybody that would like to give me a blank check and just say, whatever you like, I'll back it. Have you got some people that are willing to do that for you? Write your blank check whenever you want, without any details, and give you the blessing? I haven't met them, but here was the king. He was willing to do that. So once he had the king's approval and the signet ring, he could do whatever he wanted. And the king, like many people today, are living for the moment without considering the actions for the future. Or if they did think about them, they didn't care. They wanted what they wanted, when they wanted, because they could have it. False accusations made against the people who are innocent by others promoting their agenda, getting the green light to go ahead and remove those who they believe will hinder their progress. Now, sounds familiar for today, doesn't it? You think of all the skullduggery that's taking in political circles all throughout the world. It's got the same tarnish, the same MO as what we've got here. There's nothing new under the sun. It still works. Money talks. Hasty decisions are not thought through. And you know what? It all comes back to bite those who propose it. And, in ways you never dreamed of. Xerxes' seal of approval will have ramifications for him as king, have ramifications for Esther, his queen, and also for the Persian Empire. But he didn't think about that. It was just the moment, what we want, this is our agenda, let's go for it. The authority. Then the king said to Haman, the money and the people are yours. Do with them as you please. Wow, that's pretty good. You couldn't have worked it out better if you tried. And he had everything down pat. He mounted an aggressive campaign to persuade the king to adopt his plan. He'd been successful. Now he had everything he needed to exterminate the Jewish population. He had the king's authority, he had the king's blessing. There was nothing to stop him. It seems surreal that these two men, the king and Haman, had agreed on a plan that they thought was bulletproof, that would succeed, that nothing could impede them. Now, as I was thinking about Haman, I bet when he got the approval and the signet, all his dreams came true. He was in seventh heaven, the way things had progressed. He couldn't believe how everything had just fallen into place. All his gods, the day was right. The casting of the lots had been worthwhile. And now he's about to teach the Jewish people a lesson because he had the power, he had the money to deliver. And so he felt, life's good when a plan comes together. When you plotted this to this to this and it comes together, you couldn't get much better than that. And he revelled in, he had it all. There was only one flaw. It failed to take into account the God of the Jewish people and his involvement in his people. So all the careful planning, all the resources of Persia were no match for the plans that God had for his people in Israel. And God is the same for us. We might be experiencing the same sort of skullduggery and we can see it happening before our eyes, but it's no match for the God of heaven and his plans. They will be delivered. The projected plan in these verses: having convinced the king of your plan, you get the approval to carry out with all the resources of Persia at your fingertips. Now, you have to come up a way to be able to communicate that message to the 127 provinces throughout Persia. No, they didn't have Facebook. No, they didn't have internet. No, they didn't have carrier pigeons. So how do you get your messages out to 127 provinces? Well, yeah, but it wasn't as developed as it is today. You see, Haman, one thing that had got him to a position was he was a good organiser. In other words, he was good at getting other people on board to do most of the heavy lifting rather than doing the heavy lifting himself. At this point in time, he hadn't revealed his real intentions or agenda about how he was going to exterminate the Jewish people throughout Persia. He kept those cards close to his chest before he was ready to reveal them. He was pleased with the way things were going, probably had a little bit more swagger knowing he'd pulled off one of the greatest cons in the Persian kingdom. He had planned these things in secret, and he didn't understand the effect that his actions would have on everybody in the Persian kingdom. And what we do, no person is an island unto themselves. What we do affects one another. And Haman is setting things on a collision course that will dramatically affect every person. Not just him, but his family, all the elites, the king, and every Persian citizen and every Jewish citizen. They would be affected by his actions. He was deluded into thinking because he had the king's approval, he could go ahead. He was guaranteed immunity. The king gave him his blessing. He had no worry about consequences when his plans are now revealed. He's been given the green light, so he's going ahead. The achievement in verse 12, on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were called, and they wrote out all Haman's orders. They wrote to the king's governors and to the captains of the soldiers in each state and to the important men of each group of people. The orders were written in the writing of each state and in the language of each people. They were written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with his signet ring. Haman was taking no chances. He left no stone unturned in his endeavour to achieve his goal, exterminate the Jewish people. So he assembled all the royal secretaries. If you like, he got together the Persian public service. They're the engine room. If government wants to work, who does most of the lifting? The public service. That's what they're employed to do, carry out all the requirements. And so he carefully dictated his plans, and they were written out in every person's language so they could understand what was required. This would have been a tough job. They had no photocopiers. They had no printing presses. Each letter had to be handwritten by individual writers, then checked for spelling and errors before it was sent on its way. Can you imagine the amount of time that's spent in writing all these letters in languages? Once the letters had been approved and signed with the king's name and sealed with his signet, they were distributed to all the provincial governors and soldiers throughout Persia to be proclaimed throughout the land. Now, it was done by horseback. That takes a bit of time. The acquisition. Letters were sent by messengers to all the king's empire, ordering them to destroy, kill, completely wipe out all the Jewish people. That meant young and old, women, little children too. It was to happen on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which was Adar, and they could take everything the Jewish people owned. Some say lucky 13. It was unlucky 13 for the Jewish people. Now, the Persians had developed a wonderful postal system that extended throughout the kingdom, where couriers on horses would travel to each province with the official letters and seal of the king and distribute the contents to the people who needed to have them. Haman had been thorough in his planning and had thought of most contingencies that would arise. He wouldn't be satisfied until every Jewish person had been exterminated. So precise and so detailed were the instructions in these letters that no one had any excuse to ignore it or say, we didn't understand what we've been asked to do in the 12 months' time on a particular day. They could not say, I didn't know. Every Jew, man, woman and child, would be affected by these letters, outlining the day of their destruction, now how it was to be carried out with exceptions. And it didn't matter if you were a Jewish person, if you lived in the city, in the palace or a province, as a Jew you would be killed without hesitation or without mercy. It didn't matter where you were. On that particular day of that particular month, your name was on the list. As an added incentive, Haman told those who had received the letters instructing them about this day of destruction to be unleashed. You could take anything and everything you could find from the Jewish people that they found on that day. So can you see the incentive? He had everything covered. What could possibly go wrong? The arrangements, a copy of the order was given out as law in every state so all the people could be ready for that day. That day was meticulous in its planning concerning what was to be done. There was no room for debate or for expressing a difference of opinion. You can only imagine the predicament that all these provinces and their authorities faced when they received and opened these letters informing them that they had to begin to put in a process and plan how they were going to achieve the goal required of exterminating all the Jewish people in 127 provinces. They had no options. There was none available to them. They had no councils that they could appeal to against such a decree. This document carried the king's signature and approval, and to disobey was considered treason and worthy of death. Now put yourself in the position of some of these governors of the provinces. They knew many of the Jewish citizens. They had no problems with them. They were law-abiding citizens who were model citizens in the provinces. And I can only imagine the horror that they had to deal and put into practice a plan to kill women, children, and men in that time. It would have been something horrific, but they were given no options. Verse 15, the apprehensions. The messengers set out, hurried by the king's command, as soon as the order was given in the palace of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was in confusion. As far as Haman is concerned, done deal. All the arrangements have been made, the date was set, the requirements expressed. It was time to sit back, kick up your heels and relax until the day come. There was nothing more you could do. Everything was going as planned. He must have felt on top of the world with his plans put in place, counting down the days. His problems are getting rid of Mordecai and these troublesome Jews. You know, and where do we find him? He's slumming with the king. A tough job. Not a care in the world. No one was any the wiser about his extensive plans. He's enjoying the moment, eating and drinking with the king. Life was good. Life was going to get really good from this point on as far as he was concerned. Now it seems that the king was a willing partner. He was being hoodwinked by Haman. He had every confidence that he had made the right decision in allowing Haman to deal with this supposed threat. No doubt he was grateful to Haman for expressing his care about his welfare by telling him about the threat, and also putting some money in his coffers. So what does he do? He invites him round to have a few beers and veg out. Nothing to see here, nothing to be concerned about. Life was good, except if you're a Jewish person. This was not the case that was felt in the 127 provinces of Persia. People everywhere were confused, they were distressed and perplexed about what had been set in motion. From the palace to the public life, the air was filled with tension and uncertainty, with many Persians wondering why this needless slaughter was happening anyway. There didn't appear any justifications for slaughtering the Jewish population that was there. Other minorities were concerned at the same time, wondering if they were next on the king's list for extermination after what was put out concerning the Jews. It was a cause for concern everywhere in the kingdom. Where are we going? What on earth is happening here? What are our leaders thinking? What are they doing, implementing such a policy? Now, dare I say, in our modern society today, it's moving further and further away from the influence of God and Christianity. And our leaders are taking us down a path to destruction without realizing the consequences of what they're doing. Xerxes had no idea about the consequences. He just thought it was pretty good. It offers a solution to his problems. And many of our politicians are doing the same. They're happy to go forward if somebody else suggests and gives approval and it makes them look good. Don't think about the consequences, just do. And this is what is happening. They refuse to listen to any logic or debate. They're intent on doing what they believe is best for society. And if society does what is told, everyone will win. Now, I can only imagine the shock and horror this news would have had upon every Jewish person in Persia when they heard the news. The king had sanctioned, the king had approved. It was just hard to understand. It was hard to take. This should have turned them to God to trust for their future, standing on his promises and being light for those in darkness, standing up for the truth during the lies that were being spread like wildfire. And that's exactly what we have to do in our day and age as well. We have to stand for the truth. It might cause a bit of pain and suffering for us, but we need to be light. We need to be salt among all the lies and the darkness that's being peddled today. It's no different from the times that God's people, the Jews, found themselves in living. And next week, we're going to see that not all the best laid plans of mice and men succeed. There are twists, there are turns that take people by surprise. And it's going to take Haman, he's going to find out about his well thought out plans, how they'd be used against him. and how they're going to be taken in the weeks ahead. So next week you'll have to come and find out about how did the people respond? How did the Jewish people deal with this situation? What could they do? And the challenges lie ahead for us as well. Who do we turn to? What do we do? What stand do we take? But it's a challenge, and it's something that, the scriptures are never old. There's always some new truths that God's people in the past have exercised that we can take and learn as well. As we close, we're going to finish with 108.